The first time Calvin sat at my dining room table, he reached for the salt shaker without looking, knowing exactly where I kept it behind the ceramic pepper mill. It was a small thing. Most people wouldn't have noticed. My husband, Raymond, certainly didn't. He was busy squinting at his tablet, his thumb leaving greasy gray smudges on the screen as he scrolled through local real estate listings. My daughter, Maeve, was too occupied with adjusting the collar of her silk blouse, her eyes darting to Calvin's face every few seconds to gauge his mood. But I noticed. I had spent 31 years noticing the things that kept this family from falling apart. The exact angle Raymond liked his coffee cup turned, the low hum of the refrigerator that meant the compressor was about to fail, the specific silence that fell over Maeve when she was about to lie. "This pot roast is incredible, Mrs. Miller," Calvin said. His voice was a smooth, low baritone that seemed to absorb the ambient noise in the room. "The rosemary is a perfect touch." "Thank you, Calvin," I said, keeping my hands folded in my lap under the linen napkin. "I use fresh sprigs from the garden. I've grown them in the same spot by the back porch for 20 years. "I know," he said. The table went quiet for a heartbeat. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour, its heavy brass pendulum swinging behind the glass door. "What was that, dear?" Raymond asked, not looking up from his screen. "Did you say something about the garden?" "Just that the rosemary is fresh, Dad," Maeve said, her voice carrying that sharp, defensive edge she always used when she felt her father wasn't paying attention. She turned to Calvin, her expression softening into something so desperate it made my chest ache. "Calvin loves gardening. He was telling me about the coastal herb gardens he used to work on when he was younger." "Is that so?" Raymond muttered. "Hard to make a living off herbs." "It was a long time ago," Calvin said. He looked directly at me. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of wet slate, a different life. Before I went into consulting, I reached for my water glass. My fingers were slightly cold, and the condensation on the glass made it slippery. I had to grip it tighter than usual to keep it steady. A daughter rarely looks at her mother and sees a woman who once had a choice. To Maeve, I was simply Denise, the woman who folded her laundry, who kept the pantry stocked with the specific brand of gluten-free crackers she preferred, who stayed in the background of her life like a piece of heavy, dark oak furniture. She did not know that 12 years ago, when she was 15, and Raymond had gone on a 3-month business trip to Chicago that didn't actually involve any business, I had packed a single suitcase and driven 300 miles west to a small, damp town on the Oregon coast called Gearhart. She thought I had been at a rest cure in a private clinic for my nerves. That was the story. Raymond told the neighbors to explain why the porch light stayed off for 4 months. "Mom," Maeve said, her fork hovering over her plate, "you're barely touching your food. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine, Maeve," I said, offering her the small, reassuring smile I had practiced in the mirror for decades. "Just a bit tired. The humidity today was quite heavy." "You should let Maeve help you with the dishes tonight," Calvin said. His tone was polite, the very picture of a thoughtful future son-in-law. "In fact, I'd be happy to carry the heavy platters in for you." "No," I said, perhaps a fraction too quickly. Raymond's thumb paused on his screen. Maeve's eyebrows knitted together. I softened my voice, letting the quiet maternal exhaustion wrap around the words. "No, thank you, Calvin. I have a system for the kitchen. I prefer to do it alone." "Of course," Calvin said, bowing his head slightly. "Everyone has their sanctuary." After dinner, Raymond retreated to the den to watch the evening news. The blue light from the television screen flickered against the hallway walls, casting long, distorted shadows that reached toward the kitchen. Maeve followed me into the pantry, ostensibly to help me put away the leftover rolls, but I knew the tension in her shoulders meant she wanted to talk. She stood near the wire shelving, her fingers tracing the edge of a jar of preserved peaches. You don't like him, she said. It wasn't a question. I don't know him, Maeve, I replied, folding the linen breadcloth with precise, even creases. You've been cold to him all evening, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He's been nothing but incredibly polite to you, Mom. He bought me those earrings you liked. He listened to Dad talk about his knee surgery for 20 minutes. Why can't you just be happy for me? He's very attentive, I said. That's a bad thing? I turned to look at my daughter. She had my high cheekbones, but she had Raymond's eyes, wide, anxious, always looking for the next storm. There is a difference between a man who wants to know you, Maeve, and a man who has studied you. Maeve let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Oh, please, here we go. The marital wisdom from the woman who hasn't looked her husband in the eye since the Clinton administration. The words stung, but they did not surprise me. I had allowed my family to use me as an emotional buffer for so long that they had forgotten I could feel the impact. I am only asking you to take your time, I said quietly. You've only known him for 5 months. I know him well enough, she said, her chin tilting up in that stubborn gesture she had inherited from Raymond's mother. He makes me feel seen, Mom, which is more than I can say for anyone else in this house. She turned and walked out of the pantry, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I stood in the dim light of the pantry for a long moment, the smell of cinnamon and dried bay leaves thick in the air. Then I took a deep breath, picked up the empty serving platter, and walked back into the kitchen. Calvin was standing by the sink. He had already rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearm muscles that were corded and pale. He was holding a wet sponge, wiping down the marble countertop with slow, circular motions. He didn't look up when I entered. She's very fragile, Denise, he said, using my first name for the first time since he had entered my house. You shouldn't upset her. Get out of my kitchen, Calvin, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it was steady. He stopped wiping the counter. He turned slowly, leaning his lower back against the sink, his hands dripping water onto the linoleum floor. He looked at me with that calm, slate-blue gaze that had once made me feel like the only person alive in a foggy coastal town. I still have the blue tin, you know, he said softly. The one you left under the floorboards in the cottage. The photos are still inside. The ones from the beach near the rocks. My throat felt dry like sawdust. She is my daughter. I know, Calvin said, a faint, chilling smile touching the corners of his mouth. She looks so much like you did when you still had something left to lose. The front door clicked shut, the heavy brass latch settling into its strike plate with a finality that sounded like a small lock turning on my life. Through the sheer curtains of the living room window, I watched them walk down the concrete path. Calvin held the passenger door of his sedan open for Maeve, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Before she stepped inside, she looked up at him, her face illuminated by the amber glow of the streetlight, wearing an expression of pure, unguarded surrender. Calvin looked back toward the house. Even through the glass and the lace, I knew he was looking directly at the window where I stood. He didn't wave. He simply closed her door, walked around the hood of his car with a slow, measured stride, and drove away into the damp autumn evening. Nice young man, Raymond said from behind me. The television was murmuring a documentary about the construction of the Panama Canal. The narrator's voice flat and rhythmic. Raymond didn't look up as I entered the room, polite, not like that last fellow she brought around, who didn't even know how to shake a man's hand. Yes, I said, picking up his empty ginger ale can from the side table. He is very polite. He asked me about my pension today, Raymond muttered, adjusting the knitted blanket over his lap. It was a green blanket I had made for him 15 years ago. The edges were beginning to fray, the yarn splitting into thin gray fibers. Wanted to know if we were fully covered for the long-term care facility near the ridge, showing some foresight. Most kids these days don't think past their next paycheck. I stood there with the sticky aluminum can in my hand. And what did you tell him, Raymond? Told him we're fine, of course. Everything's in the trust. Raymond yawned, his jaw clicking slightly. No need to worry about us. Go on and finish up in the kitchen, Denise. The glare from the light is hitting the screen. I walked back into the kitchen. The marble counter where Calvin had stood was still damp. I took a dry dish towel and wiped it again, pressing down hard until my knuckles turned white, trying to erase the physical evidence of his presence. A woman who stays in an unhappy marriage for 30 years learns how to compartmentalize her mind. You build small, thick-walled rooms in your head where you store the things you cannot afford to think about while you are making school lunches or folding fitted sheets. For 12 years, the room labeled Gearhart had been sealed with heavy iron bolts. I remembered the smell of the damp pine needles on the trail leading down to the cove. I remembered the cold gray sand that got into the seams of my canvas shoes. And I remembered the 19-year-old boy who lived in the cabin at the end of the gravel road, the one who spent his afternoons repairing old fishing nets and his nights reading books about architectural theory by the light of a kerosene lamp. He had been so quiet then. Or perhaps I had simply mistaken his stillness for peace. The next afternoon, I met Maeve for lunch at a small cafe near her real estate office. It was a noisy, bright place with exposed brick walls and hard wooden chairs that made my lower back ache. Maeve was already there when I arrived, her wedding binder open on the table, surrounded by paper swatches of different shades of white, eggshell, cream, alabaster. We're thinking of an outdoor ceremony, she said without greeting me, her fingers tapping a nervous, rapid rhythm against her coffee cup. Near the river, Calvin knows a place. He says the light there at 4 o'clock in October is perfect for photographs. The river can be damp in October, Maeve, I said, setting my purse on the empty chair beside me. The guests might be cold. We can buy pashminas for everyone, she said quickly, her eyes scanning the binder. Calvin already looked into the cost. He's incredibly organized, Mom. You have no idea how much pressure he's taken off my shoulders. My manager at the office has been riding me about my listings, and if it weren't for Calvin handling the caterers, I'd be losing my mind. I watched her. There were dark, purple smudges under her eyes that even her thick concealer couldn't quite hide. She was 27, but today she looked 40. She was carrying the weight of a life she was trying too hard to make look effortless. Maeve, I said, keeping my voice low and level, how did you and Calvin meet? Truly, she paused, her thumb hovering over a swatch of silk. I told you, at the open house on Elm Street. He was looking for an investment property. And he just happened to walk into your listing. Yes, she said, her tone defensive. He was looking at the built-in shelving in the library. We started talking about old joinery techniques. Why are you interrogating me? I'm not interrogating you, sweetheart. I'm just curious. I reached across the table, intending to touch her hand, but she pulled it back to turn a page in her binder. It's just he seems very familiar with our family, with our routines. Because he cares, she said, her voice rising slightly, causing a young woman at the next table to look over. Maeve lowered her head, her cheeks flushing. He asks questions, Mom. He actually listens when I talk about my childhood. He knows how hard it was for me when you went away that summer. He understands how much that hurt me. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What did he say about that summer, Maeve? Nothing bad, she said, her expression softening into something resembling pity. He just said sometimes women of your generation get overwhelmed because they don't have their own identity. He said, it must have been very lonely for you, living with Dad's silence. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face for something she couldn't name. He has this beautiful old wooden desk in his apartment. He keeps a small metal tin in the top drawer, a blue one with faded yellow flowers on the lid. My breath caught in my throat, but I kept my face entirely still. I had spent 12 years keeping my face still. He showed me some things from it last night, Maeve continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Old postcards, dried sea lavender, and this old photograph. It was black and white, taken on a beach somewhere. There was a woman sitting on a drift log, looking out at the water. You couldn't see her face clearly because the wind had blown her hair across her cheek, but she was wearing a blue cardigan, the exact same shade as the one you used to wear when I was little. She paused, waiting for me to say something. Did he say who she was? I asked. My voice sounded thin to my own ears, like paper that had been left in the sun too long. He said she was someone who taught him how to appreciate the quiet, Maeve said, leaning back in her chair. He said she was a very beautiful, very lonely woman who made a mistake and had to go back to a life that didn't fit her anymore. Maeve reached into her leather purse and pulled out a small silver object, sliding it across the wooden table toward me. He told me to give you this, he said. He found it in the bottom of the tin, and he thought you might have dropped it. It was a small silver key, the shape of a clover leaf. It was the key to the secretary desk in our guest bedroom downstairs, the desk where I kept my old journals, my tax returns, and the deed to the house my father had left me. I picked up the silver key. It was cold, colder than the air in the cafe, as if it had been kept in a place where the sun never reached. I slid it into the small coin pocket of my purse, my movements slow and deliberate, while Maeve watched me with an expression that was almost eager. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to gasp, or weep, or perhaps confess to some ancient, dusty sin so she could play the role of the forgiving, modern daughter. I gave her nothing but a small, tight nod. Thank you, Maeve, I said. I must have dropped it near the hall closet when I was looking for the winter blankets last week. He's so observant, she murmured, already looking back down at her swatches of white silk. He notices everything. Sometimes it's almost scary. Yes, I said, rising from the table. It is. I left her there, surrounded by her expensive plans for a perfect October afternoon by the river. The drive home was quiet. The sky had turned the color of wet asphalt, and the windshield wipers on my sedan made a dry, rhythmic squeak against the glass that sounded like a finger dragging across a clean window. I drove past the pharmacy, past the supermarket where I had bought groceries every Tuesday for 25 years, past the neat, identical lawns of our suburban street. Everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Yet it all felt thin, like a painted stage set that would wobble if I pressed my hand too hard against it. When I entered the house, the smell of Raymond's stale coffee was thick in the hallway. He was asleep in his recliner, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, his mouth slightly open. The television was still on, a low-budget midday courtroom show where strangers screamed at each other over unpaid car loans. I didn't wake him. I walked past his chair, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the carpet, and climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. The guest room was always cold. It was the room where we put the things we didn't know what else to do with. An old sewing machine that no longer threaded properly, a box of Raymond's college textbooks, and the cherrywood secretary desk my father had built for me when I turned 18. I closed the bedroom door behind me and turned the lock. The click of the mechanism was a tiny, sharp sound in the quiet house. I walked over to the desk. It sat in the corner between the two narrow windows, its wood dark and polished, catching the dull gray light from the afternoon sky. I took the silver clover key from my purse, my hand steady now, and inserted it into the small brass keyhole beneath the roll-top lid. It turned with a soft, oiled click. I slid the lid up. The small cubbyholes inside were neat. My letters from my sister were still tied in their faded yellow ribbon. My father's death certificate was still in its plastic sleeve, but when I reached into the back right corner, into the small, hidden compartment where the wood panel slid away, if you pressed the knot in the grain, my fingers met nothing but empty air. The velvet box was gone. My mother's ring had been inside that box. It wasn't a large diamond, just a modest Edwardian-cut stone set in a thin band of platinum with a slightly chipped emerald cut on the southern prong. It was the only thing of value my mother had left me, the only thing that hadn't been swallowed by the estate taxes or Raymond's failed business venture in the late 90s. I leaned my forehead against the cool cherry wood of the desk, a memory, sharp and unwanted, cut through the darkness of my mind. Gearhart 2014, the small cabin with the screen door that always let in the sandflies. Calvin had been sitting on the floor by my knees, his head resting against my thigh, while the rain beat a steady, frantic tattoo on the tin roof. He had taken my left hand, his young, rough fingers tracing the outline of that very ring. "It's too heavy for you," he had whispered, his voice warm with the salt air of the coast. "It looks like a shackle. If you stayed here, with me, I'd make you a ring out of sea glass, something that doesn't weigh you down." I had laughed then. I had thought it was the sweet, foolish romanticism of a 19-year-old boy who didn't understand that women like me didn't get to live in cabins on the beach forever. I didn't realize that even then he was measuring the weight of my chains. I pulled my head back from the desk. My eyes fell on the small built-in drawer to the left. I opened it. Inside was my journal from that summer. It was a simple black composition book, the kind children use for school. I pulled it out and opened the cover. The pages had been cut. Someone had used a very sharp blade, likely a razor, to slice through the paper close to the binding. 22 pages were missing. The entries from July 14th to August 28th. The weeks when Raymond had stopped calling, the weeks when I had allowed myself to believe that the woman standing in the surf in Gearhart was the real me, had been entirely removed. In their place, tucked neatly into the spine of the book, was a small, white slip of paper. It was a printed receipt from a local jewelry store on Grand Avenue, dated 3 weeks ago. The transaction was for an alteration and resizing. The name on the customer line was Calvin Vance, and beneath the receipt was a photograph. It wasn't an old photo from Gearhart. It was a new one, printed on cheap matte paper from a drugstore kiosk. It showed Maeve, taken from a distance, through what looked like the window of a restaurant. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand resting on her collarbone, and on her ring finger, catching the bright artificial light of the restaurant's chandelier, was my mother's Edwardian diamond. He hadn't stolen it to sell it. He had given it to her. He had taken the only piece of my mother I had left, resized it, and slipped it onto my daughter's hand as a promise of their future. And Maeve, in her desperate need to believe she was cherished, had accepted it without once asking where it came from. Or perhaps he had told her it was a gift from him, a vintage piece he had curated specifically for her classic taste. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked. The heavy, shuffling footsteps of my husband moved from the den toward the kitchen. "Denise!" Raymond called out, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "Where's the tea?" "It's past 4. I closed the journal. I slid the lid of the desk down, turned the silver clover key, and put it back into my pocket. "I'm coming, Raymond," I said to the empty room. Downstairs, the tea kettle was whistling, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the hallways like a small drill. I took a breath, smoothed the front of my skirt, and walked down the stairs. Raymond was already in the kitchen, standing by the stove with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at the boiling kettle with a sort of vague, helpless annoyance, as if the steam were a personal insult directed at him. "You're late with this," he grumbled, not looking at me as I took the kettle off the flame. "My program starts in 5 minutes. I was putting some things away upstairs, I said, my voice steady, my fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic handle of the teapot. The guest room needed sorting. Calvin called while you were up there, Raymond said. He sat down at the small laminate table, in the breakfast nook, his knees knocking against the metal leg. Said he's got a friend who's a mechanic. Wants to take your car in on Thursday. Said he noticed. The engine was idling rough when he arrived yesterday. I stopped pouring the water. A single drop of boiling water fell onto the back of my hand. I didn't wipe it away. I let the small, sharp burn bloom on my skin. My car is fine, Raymond, I said. It's 10 years old, Denise. It's not fine, Raymond snapped, reaching for the sugar bowl. The boy is trying to be helpful. He's taking me to my vascular specialist next Tuesday, too. Said you shouldn't have to drive in the city traffic with your eyesight what it is. My eyesight is perfectly fine for driving. Well, he thinks you're under too much stress, Raymond said, stirring 3 spoonfuls of sugar into his tea. The spoon made a light, metallic clinking against the porcelain, a sound that had defined the mornings of my life for 30 years. He told me you looked thin. Said a woman your age shouldn't have to carry the whole weight of the household. I told him he's right. You've been moody lately. Ever since Maeve brought him home, you've been walking around like a ghost. Like a ghost. I looked at my husband, at the gray hair thinning at his temples, the dry, papery skin around his collar, the small, selfish mouth that had spent decades consuming my youth without ever once asking what it tasted like. He didn't see me. He hadn't seen me in 30 years. But Calvin saw me. He saw me so clearly that he was already reaching into my home, sliding his fingers under the loose edges of my life and peeling me away from the only family I had left. He is very thoughtful, I said quietly, setting the teacup in front of Raymond. That's what I've been saying, Raymond muttered, already looking past me, toward the television in the den. The boy is a keeper. Maeve's lucky. We're all lucky. The address of Calvin's apartment was in the Riverfront District, a newly developed strip of town where the old brick warehouses had been gutted and turned into luxury lofts with steel beams and floor-to-ceiling glass. It was a place for people with no history, clean, expensive, and entirely devoid of dust. I did not call ahead. I drove my rough idling car into the concrete parking garage, walked past the security desk with a polite nod that suggested I belonged there, and took the silent stainless steel elevator to the 4th floor. When I knocked on the door of apartment 412, I expected a delay. I expected him to be surprised. Instead, the door opened almost immediately. Calvin was wearing a gray cashmere sweater, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He didn't have his shoes on. He was in thick woolen socks that made him look younger, softer, almost like the boy who used to sit on the drafty floor of the cabin in Gearhart. But his eyes were not soft. They were slate gray, watchful, and entirely unsurprised. "Denise," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. "The tea is just steeping. I bought the loose-leaf jasmine you like, the one from the import market on 4th Street. I stepped into the apartment. The space was open and bright, the afternoon light reflecting off the polished concrete floors. In the corner, near the massive window overlooking the gray, sluggish river, sat the old wooden desk. It was the only antique in the room, its dark pine wood looking heavy and stubborn against the minimalist white walls. "You took my mother's ring," I said. I did not sit down. I kept my coat on, my purse held tightly against my ribs like a shield. Calvin walked over to a small, sleek kitchen island. He poured the tea from a glass pot into 2 simple white ceramic cups. "I didn't take it, Denise. I relocated it. It was wasted in that desk. You never wore it. You haven't worn it since the day you came back to Raymond. It was not yours to give. It belonged to a woman who once loved me," he said, his voice quiet and completely devoid of anger. He carried the 2 cups over to the desk, setting one down on the dark wood and holding the other in his hands. A woman who told me on a Tuesday in August that she wished she had met me 20 years ago so she wouldn't have had to spend her life serving tea to a man who doesn't know her middle name. I was 42, Calvin, I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts. You were 19. I was lonely, and I was foolish, and I made a mistake. A mistake? He looked down at the desk, his finger tracing the edge of the dark pine. 12 weeks of your life, Denise. You didn't talk about Raymond once. You didn't talk about the suburbs. You told me about the books you wanted to read, the places you wanted to see. You let me touch you like you were made of glass, not stone. And then I went home, I said, because I had a daughter, a 15-year-old girl who was crying on the phone because her father didn't know how to cook a meal or look her in the eye. And look how that turned out, Calvin said. He stepped closer to me, his slate-gray eyes holding mine with a terrible, steady intensity. You came back to save her, and yet she's exactly like you were. She's anxious, she's lonely, and she's looking for someone to tell her she's real. So I did. You don't love her, I whispered. I know her, he corrected softly. I know her because she is made of your silence, Denise. Every time you kept your mouth shut to keep the peace, you wrote another page of Maeve's insecurity. I've spent 5 months filling those spaces. I know her favorite flowers. I know she hates the sound of the wind through the screen doors. I know how to make her feel like the center of the world. He took a sip of his tea, his gaze never leaving my face. If you tell her the truth, he said, she will never look at you again without seeing the woman who ruined her chance at happiness. She will hate you for being the reason her perfect life fell apart. And Raymond, well, Raymond's pension is very comfortable, but I don't think his heart would survive the public embarrassment of a 12-year-old scandal. Are you blackmailing me, Calvin? No, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a cold draft against my neck. I'm giving you what you always wanted. I'm giving you a front row seat to the family you built. He reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He laid it on the desk next to the teacup. He's coming over in 20 minutes, he said. We're going to look at the catering menu. You should probably go, but take this with you. It's from your journal, page 14. The parking garage beneath Calvin's building was cold, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. I sat in my car, the engine idling with that low, irregular shudder Raymond had insisted was my imagination. My hands were shaking, but not with the sharp, erratic tremors of fear. It was a dull, heavy vibration, the kind of trembling that comes after you've carried a heavy load up a long hill and finally set it down, only to find your muscles have forgotten how to rest. I unfolded the yellowed page he had given me. The paper was torn rough along the left edge, where his blade had slipped slightly near the binding. My own handwriting looked back at me, rounder, then less cramped than the tight, careful script I used now to write out grocery lists and doctor appointments. The ink was blue, faded slightly to the color of a winter sky. July 28, 2014. Calvin asked me today if I missed my home. I lied and said yes. The truth is, when I think of the house on Elm Street, I don't see a home. I see a museum where I am the only living exhibit. I don't miss Raymond's silence, and God forgive me, I don't even miss Maeve's voice. When I am with Calvin, the air is lighter. I feel like a person, not a container for everyone else's needs. If I could run away and never look back, I would. I am terrified of the day I have to go back and pretend that loving them is enough for me. I look at Maeve's letters and I feel nothing but a cold, heavy gray weight in my stomach. She is 15, but she already holds me like a jailer. A horn blared somewhere on the street above, the sound muffled by the concrete ceiling. I folded the paper back into its creases, slowly matching the edges exactly. The hardest thing about maternal sacrifice isn't the giving up of your life. It's the realization that the people you saved will eventually demand that you thank them for the privilege of being erased. Maeve had spent her teenage years punishing me for that 4-month absence with a passive-aggressive cruelty only a daughter can manage. Every forgotten chore, every bad grade, every teenage heartbreak had been laid at my door, a direct consequence of the summer Mom went away. And I had accepted it. I had spent 12 years apologizing in silence, baking her favorite pies, listening to her complaints about her friends, paying her credit card bills when her commission checks ran short. I had let her believe I was the villain of her childhood, because it was easier than letting her know. Her father didn't care enough to notice I was gone, and her mother had briefly wished she had never been born. If she read this page, the fragile, anxious structure of her self-worth would collapse. She already believed she was hard to love. This would be the proof. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the space. I didn't drive home. Instead, I drove to the municipal reservoir at the edge of town. It was an ugly, utilitarian place surrounded by a high chain-link fence, but it was quiet. I parked near the water treatment building, where the only sound was the low industrial hum of the pumps. I sat there as the gray afternoon dissolved into a bruised purple twilight. Calvin wasn't just threatening me. He was conducting an experiment. He had spent his youth watching me succumb to the pressure of my family's demands, watching me break under the weight of Raymond's indifference and Maeve's neediness. Now, he wanted to see if I would break the same way twice. He had created a perfect, enclosed system where every choice I made would result in the destruction of the people I had destroyed myself to keep whole. My phone vibrated in my purse. I reached in and pulled it out. The screen showed a text from Maeve. "Mom, where are you? Dad said you weren't home for dinner. We have amazing news." I didn't reply. I let the phone go dark, then turned the ignition and drove back to the house on Elm Street. The kitchen windows were bright when I pulled into the driveway. Through the glass, I could see Raymond standing by the stove. He had his sleeves rolled up, and he was stirring something in a large pot, an unusual sight, as Raymond's culinary skills began and ended with toast. When I opened the back door, the smell of burnt garlic and cheap tomato paste hit me. "Where have you been?" Raymond asked, not looking up from the pot. He was using my wooden spoon, scraping the bottom of the pan with a harsh scratching sound that set my teeth on edge. "Maeve's been trying to call you. Calvin, too." My phone was on silent, I said, taking off my coat and hanging it on the hook behind the door. "I was running errands." "Well, you missed it," Raymond said, a rare, genuine smile stretching his dry lips. "Calvin stopped by a little while ago. He brought over some of that wild salmon he caught last month, and he sorted out the wedding venue." I stood by the counter, my hands flat against the cold laminate. "The venue? The old mill by the river," Raymond said, turning off the burner with a sharp click. "Apparently, the owner is a client of his. He got us a 50% discount on the booking fee, but we have to go down there this Saturday to sign the papers and look at the layout." He walked over to the table and sat down, his movements lighter than they had been in months. "Calvin's renting a van. Said my knees wouldn't do well in your little sedan for a 2-hour drive. He's going to drive us all down together. We'll make a day of it. Have lunch at that tavern by the water." The trap had closed. 4 hours in a closed vehicle, with Calvin, my husband, and my daughter. 4 hours of playing the grateful, quiet mother, while the man who held my private shame in his pocket steered us toward the river. "I don't think I can go on Saturday, Raymond," I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "I have the Altar Guild meeting at the church." Raymond's smile vanished, replaced by that familiar, heavy scowl that had governed our household for 3 decades. "Don't be ridiculous, Denise," he said, his voice rising. "Your only daughter is getting married, and the boy has gone out of his way to make sure we're looked after. "You're going. I already told Maeve we'd be ready by 9." He stood up, leaving his dirty plate on the table, and walked toward the den. "And wash that spoon," he called out over his shoulder. "The sauce is sticking to it." I looked down at the wooden spoon. The red sauce was drying on the light wood, turning the color of old rust. I picked it up and held it under the cold water faucet, watching the red dye run down the drain, thinking of the long, quiet road to the river. The days leading up to Saturday passed with the slow, gray utility of a winter week. I kept to my routines. I boiled the starch for Raymond's shirts. I wiped down the baseboards in the hallway. I drove to the garden center and bought 3 small pots of winter pansies, planting them in the dirt by the front steps, even though the ground was already cold enough to stunt their roots. I needed to feel my fingers in something cold and real, something that didn't demand an explanation. On Wednesday, Maeve called me while I was paring potatoes over the sink. "Mom," she said, her voice bright and breathless, the sound of a woman who had spent her day running from one appointment to another. "Calvin found the music for the cocktail hour. You'll never guess what he suggested." "What did he suggest, Maeve?" I asked, holding a potato under the thin stream of tap water. "That old Chet Baker record, the one with the blue cover that you used to play when I was little, before you had your breakdown. I didn't even think they pressed that on vinyl anymore, but Calvin found a copy at an estate sale in Portland," he said. "It has this quiet, nostalgic quality that reminds him of a coastal summer." The potato slipped from my hand, hitting the bottom of the stainless steel sink with a dull, hollow clack. "He is very thorough," I said. "He's perfect," she corrected, her voice dropping into that soft, reverent tone that made me want to reach through the line and shake her. "I don't know how I got so lucky, Mom. Sometimes I look at him and I feel like he was made just for me, like he knew exactly what was missing in my life before I even did." A man who seems too perfect is usually hiding the parts of himself that aren't, Maeve, I said quietly. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate, sharp, and cold as a draft through a cracked window pane. "You just can't stand it, can you?" Maeve said, her voice trembling with a sudden hot anger. "You can't stand that I have someone who actually cares about me, who doesn't look at me like I'm a chore. You spent my whole life being a martyr, Mom, and now that I have a chance at something real, you want to drag me down into the mud with you." "That's not what I'm doing, sweetheart. Don't call me that," she snapped. "I'll see you on Saturday. Just please try to be happy for once. For me, if you can manage it." She hung up. I stood there for a long time, the tap water running over the peeled potato, washing away the starch until the flesh turned gray. Saturday morning arrived with a thin, watery frost that lay over the lawn like a shroud of salt. At exactly 9 o'clock, a large, dark blue transit van pulled into our driveway. It was a massive, sterile-looking vehicle, the kind used by airport shuttle services or high-end retirement communities to transport residents to the theater. Calvin got out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a dark wool coat and a cream-colored scarf that made him look remarkably handsome, like an actor in a British television drama. He walked up the concrete path with a quick, energetic stride, helping Raymond down the steps with a gentle, supportive hand under his elbow. "Careful on the frost, Raymond," Calvin said, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. "We don't want those knees acting up before we get to the river." "Good lad," Raymond muttered, leaning heavily on him. "Denise, get the door. And don't forget my thermo flask." I followed them to the van, carrying the silver flask and Raymond's orthopedic seat cushion. Maeve was already inside, sitting in the front passenger seat. She didn't look at me as I climbed in, her eyes fixed on the navigation screen on the dashboard. "Raymond, why don't you take the middle row?" Calvin suggested, adjusting the headrest. "More legroom for you. Denise, if you don't mind the back row, there's more room to stretch out back there." "I don't mind," I said. I climbed into the very back of the van. The seats were covered in dark gray leather that smelled of synthetic pine and new plastic. The tinted windows were so thick they turned the bright morning sky into a dull leaden slate. Calvin climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted his mirrors, and started the engine. The van rose smoothly out of the driveway, the suspension absorbing the dip of the curb so gently we barely felt it. From my seat in the back, I had a perfect view of their heads. There was the back of Raymond's neck, red, lined with deep creases, his thin gray hair combed carefully over his bald spot. Next to him, Maeve's blonde head was tilted toward side window, her fingers twirling the silver ring on her left hand. And in the driver's seat was Calvin, his shoulders broad and steady under his dark wool coat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I was entirely behind them. I was the observer, the passenger in the vehicle of my own family's future, tucked away in the shadows where no one had to look at me. As we reached the highway, the city began to thin out, replaced by flat gray fields of winter rye and dark stands of Douglas fir. Calvin reached for the dashboard controls. "I found a local station that plays some old folk tracks," he said, his voice coming through the van's speakers with a crisp digital clarity. I thought it might make the drive a bit more pleasant. He turned the dial. The music that filled the van was a quiet, acoustic melody. The slow, finger-picked notes of a guitar followed by the low, haunting whistle of a wooden flute. It was an instrumental track from a local Oregon artist, a man who only sold his recordings out of a small bait shop in Gearhart. We had listened to that exact CD on the small portable player in his cabin while the storm took the shingles off the roof. Maeve sighed, leaning her head against the headrest. "Oh, this is beautiful. It sounds like water." "It does," Calvin said. He glanced up at the rearview mirror. In the small rectangular glass, his slate-gray eyes found mine. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply held my gaze for 3 long seconds, while the acoustic guitar played the melody of a summer I had spent 12 years trying to forget. "Do you like the music, Denise?" he asked over the speaker. "It's very quiet," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was beating against my ribs like a trapped bird. "But sometimes, Calvin, the quietest things are the most dangerous." "The heater's too high back here, Calvin," Raymond grumbled from the middle row, his dry, papery voice cutting through the acoustic music. "And turn that whistling down. It's like having a mosquito in your ear." "Of course, Raymond. My apologies," Calvin said. With a smooth practiced movement, he turned the dial. The music died instantly, replaced by the low, heavy hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical, settling over the seats like a damp blanket. We drove in that quiet for another 40 miles, turning off the state highway onto a narrow, winding road that followed the course of the river. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and green with moss, their branches overlapping above us to block out what little light the gray clouds had left. The Blackwood Mill sat on a sharp bend in the river, where the water narrowed and ran fast over a bed of dark, jagged rocks. It was a massive, 4-story structure built of red brick that had turned almost black from a century of river damp. The windows were small and square, many of them covered with dark iron grates. As Calvin parked the van in the gravel lot, the roar of the river was the first thing that reached us, a heavy, relentless sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the vehicle. "Oh, Calvin," Maeve breathed, her forehead pressed against the glass of the passenger window. "It looks like something out of a storybook." "It has character," Calvin said, turning off the engine, "and history. That's what makes a wedding memorable, don't you think, Denise?" "History can be very heavy," Calmy said, sliding my purse strap over my shoulder. "Sometimes the foundation isn't as strong as it looks." "Well, we'll just have to inspect it then," he replied, giving me a small, polite nod through his rearview mirror. The air outside was freezing, smelling of wet cedar and decaying leaves. Raymond struggled to get his legs out of the van, his joints popping with a dry, wooden sound that was swallowed by the roar of the water. Calvin was there instantly, his hand firm under Raymond's arm, guiding him over the slick gravel toward the heavy oak doors of the mill. "The owner let me have the keys for the afternoon," Calvin explained, pulling a heavy brass ring from his coat pocket. "He wanted us to have the run of the place without a coordinator hovering over us. He knew we'd appreciate the privacy." The lock turned with a loud metallic clank that sounded like a rifle shot. Inside, the mill was vast and cold. The air smelled of old grease, sawdust, and the wet stone of the river wall. Massive heart pine pillars stretched up to a ceiling, crisscrossed with thick wooden gears and iron shafts that had once turned the great millstones. Raymond immediately found a wooden bench near the cold stone fireplace and sat down with a heavy sigh, rubbing his thigh. "Go on ahead," he said, waving his hand toward the stairs. "I'm not climbing 3 flights of stairs just to look at drafty rafters. Take some pictures, Maeve." "I'll go up to the loft first," Maeve said, her eyes wide as she looked up at the open timber gallery 3 stories above. "Calvin said the bridal suite has a balcony overlooking the rapids. Come with me, Calvin." "You go on up, sweetheart," Calvin said, his voice warm. "I want to show your mother the old wheelhouse on the lower level."
There's a beautiful stone archway down there she might want to use for the family portraits.
Maeve looked at me, her expression a mix of hesitation and that lingering, defensive resentment. "Don't go finding things to complain about, Mom," she said quietly. "It's a beautiful place." "I am only looking, Maeve," I said. She turned and ran up the heavy wooden stairs, her boots making a hollow, drumming sound on the pine treads. Once the sound of her footsteps faded into the upper rafters, Calvin turned to me. The polite, attentive future son-in-law vanished, replaced by the quiet, still man I had known in Gearhart. He didn't move closer. He simply stood by the cold hearth, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. "It's cold down here," I said, my voice flat. "The river keeps it that way," he replied. "It never really warms up. Even in July, you can feel the damp in the stone." He walked slowly toward the narrow wooden stairs that led down to the wheelhouse, gesturing for me to follow. "Come, I want to show you what Raymond signed yesterday." My chest tightened. "What did Raymond sign, Calvin?" I followed him down the stairs. The air grew colder, wetter, the roar of the river rising to a deafening thunder as we reached the lower level. Here, the floor was made of massive stone slabs, slick with a thin film of green algae. Through a series of heavy iron grates in the wall, we could see the river itself, gray, frothing, rushing past just inches from the foundation. Calvin stopped near a rusted iron sluice gate. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Not my journal page, but a clean, white piece of legal paper bearing the logo of our local credit union. "Raymond's memory is getting quite short, Denise," Calvin said over the noise of the water. "He forgot that his name is the only one on the deed to the Elm Street house. Your father might have left it to you in his will, but when Raymond refinanced it in '98 to pay off his business debts, he put it in his name. Do you remember that? I did. It was the year I had stopped arguing. The year I realized that fighting Raymond was like throwing stones into a swamp. They simply sank, leaving no trace." "He signed a co-signatory from yesterday," Calvin continued, his voice calm, almost clinical. "He made Maeve the primary trustee of his estate, with me as the alternative executor in case of her incapacity. He thinks it's a tax shelter. I told him it would protect the family from probate if his vascular issues got worse." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me in the dim light of the wheelhouse. "The house is Maeve's now, Denise. Or rather, it will be the moment they sign the marriage certificate in October. And since Maeve relies on me for everything, well, you see how the structure works now, don't you?" You are going to take my home, I whispered. My voice was swallowed by the roar of the water, but he heard me. He was close enough to see the gray hairs at my temples, close enough to smell the lavender soap I used. I'm not taking anything, Calvin said, a faint, chilling softness in his voice. I'm just making sure you have nowhere else to go. You left me in Gearhart because you said you had to keep your family together. Now your family is mine. If you want to stay inside it, you'll have to live by my rules. He reached out, his fingers cold as the river stone, and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. Maeve's calling for us, he said, his face returning to that bright, polite mask, as he looked past my shoulder toward the stairs. We should go back up before she gets anxious. We climbed the wooden stairs back into the main hall of the mill, the roar of the river fading to a low, rhythmic vibration beneath our feet. Maeve was waiting for us by the cold hearth, holding her digital camera. Her face was flushed with the cold, and her eyes were bright, that anxious, desperate energy of hers finally directed into something resembling joy. Look at these, Mom, she said, holding the small screen out to me. Her thumb clicked through the images. Dusty timber lofts, a narrow balcony over the rushing gray water, the dark brick of the exterior walls catching the pale winter light. The light up there is incredible. If we set the altar near the north window, the river will be right behind us. It's very dramatic, Maeve, I said, keeping my hands deep in my coat pockets where she couldn't see them trembling. A beautiful setting. Maeve turned to Calvin, her smile wide and unguarded. I told you she'd like it. She's always quiet when she's taking things in. I know, Calvin said. He gave me a polite, deferential smile that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. Your mother has always been a very careful observer. We helped Raymond back to the van. The cold drizzle had started, turning the gravel lot into a slick gray soup. Calvin guided Raymond with that same practiced patience, holding the heavy door open as my husband climbed inside with a grunt. We drove half a mile down the river road to the Blackwood Tavern, a low-slung building made of cedar shakes that had turned black from decades of river damp. Inside, the tavern was warm and dark, smelling of wood smoke, fried onions, and the wet wool of the patrons' coats drying near the stone fireplace in the corner. We sat in a corner booth near the window. Raymond immediately ordered a hot toddy, his mood uncharacteristically buoyant. The outing, the drinks, and the sense of having secured his affairs had given him a rare, talkative energy. I've got to hand it to you, Calvin, Raymond said, leaning his heavy elbows on the sticky wooden table. That fellow at the credit union was very impressed with how we structured the trust. Said it's the cleanest setup he's seen for a family of our size. Usually, these things get mired in probate for years, but this is neat. I wanted to make sure you and Denise were protected, Raymond, Calvin said, his voice smooth as he ordered a club soda, especially with the new venture launching next month. A clean portfolio is essential when you're dealing with institutional lenders. Venture? I asked, my fingers curling around my water glass. Raymond waved his hand dismissively, his face slightly flushed from the warm alcohol. Oh, didn't Calvin tell you, Denise? His consulting firm is merging with that development group out of Seattle. Pacific Meridian, they're called. Big players. They're building those new townhomes near the marina. It's a wonderful opportunity, Maeve said, reaching across the table to touch Calvin's sleeve. He's going to be a senior partner. But the Seattle board is very traditional. They want to see that their partners have deep roots in the community. Stable assets, family estates. Exactly, Raymond chimed in, taking a long sip of his toddy. Lenders like to see continuity. They don't want some transient fellow with no skin in the game, showing them the Elm Street property, a multi-generational family home with a clean title. It's the perfect collateral to show stability. It gives the Seattle group confidence. My chest felt so tight I could barely draw air. He wasn't just playing a psychological game. With me, he was running out of time. The marriage in October wasn't just a deadline for his obsession. It was a deadline for his finances. He needed the Elm Street deed, my father's house, to use as a financial shield for his merger. He had spent months studying us, finding the cracks in our family. And now he was going to use those cracks to swallow the only thing of value we had left, to pay his way into a Seattle partnership. "And what happens, Calvin?" I said, my voice quiet and perfectly clear over the clinking of glasses at the bar. "If the development in Seattle doesn't succeed, what happens to the collateral then?" The table went completely quiet. Maeve's smile vanished, her eyes hardening as she looked at me. "Mom, please, don't start with the doom and gloom. Calvin knows what he's doing." "It's a standard business practice, Denise," Raymond said, his tone sharp with irritation. "You don't understand how these transactions work. You've never had to manage anything larger than a grocery budget." "I'm just asking a question, Raymond," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on Calvin. Calvin didn't look angry. He looked at me with a calm, pitying expression that was far worse. "It's a fair question, Denise," he said softly, "but Pacific Meridian is fully bonded. The risk to the trust is virtually non-existent. I would never put Maeve's future, or yours, at risk." "He's been working 80 hours a week to get this sorted, Mom," Maeve said, her voice trembling with that defensive anger I knew too well. "The least you could do is thank him for keeping us involved." Before I could answer, Calvin's phone vibrated on the wooden table. He glanced down at the screen. For a fraction of a second, the polite, calm mask slipped. A tiny muscle in his jaw twitched, and his slate-gray eyes narrowed. It was a look I had never seen on him, not in Gearhart and not here. It was the look of a man who had just seen a crack in his own foundation. He picked up the phone immediately. "Excuse me," he said, rising from the booth with a polite nod. "I have to take this. It's the Seattle office. They've been trying to reach me all morning about the title transition." He walked toward the small, dim foyer near the restrooms. I waited 30 seconds, then I stood up. "Where are you going?" Raymond grumbled, reaching for the basket of fries the waitress had just set down. "I need to wash my hands," I said. "The damp in the mill got into my skin." I walked slowly across the tavern floor, the soles of my shoes silent on the sawdust-strewn wood. The foyer was narrow, lit only by a single amber bulb. Calvin was standing near the payphone at the end of the hall, his back to me, his head bowed. He was speaking in a whisper, but the acoustics of the narrow hallway carried his words clearly. "I told you I need 2 more weeks," Calvin said. His voice was no longer smooth. It was tight, strained, carrying a sharp, desperate edge that made him sound like the 19-year-old boy who used to beg me not to leave him on the beach. "The title transition is already signed. I just need the marriage certificate to finalize the transfer to the trust. If you pull the funding now, the Seattle group will walk." No, she doesn't know. Neither of them know. I have it under control." He paused, listening. His shoulders were tense, the cashmere of his sweater bunching near his neck. "If you call the house again," Calvin whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous hissing rasp, "I will make sure you don't get a single dollar of the estate. Do you understand me? I have the signatures. Just wait." I stood in the shadow of the vending machine, my breath held, my fingers dug into the vinyl of my purse. Calvin wasn't just leveraged. He was being hunted. I slipped into the restroom before Calvin turned around. The air in the small tiled room was cold, smelling of cheap pine disinfectant and damp paper towels. I stood in front of the sink, resting my palms against the cold porcelain, and looked at myself in the mirror. The fluorescent light above the glass was harsh, highlighting the deep, bracketed lines around my mouth and the quiet, permanent exhaustion in my eyes. I looked like a woman who had spent 30 years letting her own life be consumed to keep a house warm. But beneath that exhaustion, For the first time in 12 years, I felt a cold, sharp spark of clarity. Calvin wasn't a ghost. He wasn't some all-knowing, inescapable force of nature sent to punish me for my brief moment of freedom. He was just a man, a desperate, highly leveraged man who had built a house of cards out of other people's trust. And the wind was beginning to blow. He needed my father's house because he had already burned through his own. When I returned to the table, the hot food had arrived. Calvin was already back in his seat, his cashmere sleeves folded neatly, laughing at some dry joke Raymond had made about the local property tax assessor. He looked entirely in control, but I noticed the way his thumb kept rubbing against the side of his glass, a rapid, nervous twitch that he couldn't quite still. We finished our lunch in a superficial, straining, polite silence. Maeve did most of the talking, her voice carrying a manic, fragile brightness as she discussed the flower arrangements and the linen options for the reception. Raymond nodded occasionally, his eyes glazed over with the heavy lethargy of the alcohol and his vascular medication. The drive back was long and heavy. The rain had turned into a steady, gray downpour that drummed relentlessly against the roof of the van. Calvin drove with a rigid, silent concentration, his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt ahead, while Raymond snored softly in the middle row. Maeve fell asleep too, her head tilted against the cold passenger window, her fingers still loosely wrapping the silver ring on her hand. I sat in the very back, watching them through the shadows, feeling the miles slip away like water under a bridge. When we finally pulled into the driveway on Elm Street, the afternoon was already dissolving into a dark, watery dusk. Calvin helped Raymond out of the van and up the front steps, his manner still perfectly polite, though his movements were quicker now, more hurried. "I won't come in, Raymond," Calvin said at the door, his voice strained with a fatigue he couldn't quite hide. "I have to get back to the office. Some paperwork for the Seattle board needs to be overnighted." "Of course, son," Raymond muttered, shaking his hand. "Get to it. Don't let us hold you up." Maeve decided to go with him. "I'll help you with the printing, Calvin," she said, looking back at me with a cold, defensive expression that told me she still hadn't forgiven me for my lunch table questions. "We'll have dinner at his place, Dad. Don't wait up." I watched the blue transit van pull out of the driveway, its red taillights disappearing into the gray curtain of the rain. Inside, the house felt cold and empty. Raymond immediately went to the den, turning on the television to block out the sound of the storm, while I walked into the kitchen to prepare his evening tea. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the amber glow of the digital clock on the stove. I stood by the counter, waiting for the kettle to heat, when the telephone rang. It was the landline, the old cream-colored wall phone next to the pantry that we kept, because Raymond didn't trust digital connections. Its mechanical bell rang with a loud, shrill urgency that made me jump. I picked up the receiver on the second ring. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, filled only with the soft, static hiss of a long-distance connection. Then a voice spoke. It was an old voice, dry, gravelly, carrying the flat, slow vowels of the Pacific Northwest. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 12 years, but I recognized it instantly. It was the voice of the woman who had left fresh brown eggs on my porch in Gerhardt. "Denise?" the voice said. My hand tightened on the plastic receiver. "Irene? I figured you'd be the one to answer," Irene Vance said. She let out a dry, rattling cough that sounded like leaves scraping across concrete. "He's there, isn't he? Playing the gentleman. He always was good at that." "What do you want, Irene?" I whispered, my eyes darting toward the hallway to make sure Raymond was still in the den. "I don't want anything from you, Denise," she said, her voice heavy with a profound, bitter weariness. "But you need to listen to me. Calvin's drowning. He took my house in Gerhardt, had me sign some papers when my eyes started going, told me it was a reverse mortgage to pay for my treatments. Now the bank's taking the land. He used it to pay off his partners in Seattle, and now they're coming after him for the rest. She paused, her breathing shallow and ragged over the line. He's been planning this since the day you walked out of my cabin, Denise. He was obsessed with you. When you left, he spent weeks sitting in that empty room, looking at your things. He hates you for leaving, but he hates himself more for letting you go. He's going to take your daughter, and he's going to take your house, and he's going to leave you with nothing but the quiet. How did he find Maeve? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't find her by accident, Irene said. He kept track of you. He had your address. He knew when she went into real estate. He's been waiting for the right moment, and now that his debts are catching up to him, he's moving. You have to warn her, Denise. I tried, I said, a tear finally slipping down my cheek, hot and stinging. She won't listen to me. She thinks I'm bitter. She thinks I'm jealous. Then you have to show her, Irene said. You have to show her the photos from the blue tin, the ones he took of you on the beach. She needs to see his face next to yours from 12 years ago. It's the only thing that will break his hold on her. I don't have them, Irene, I whispered. Calvin has the tin. No, he doesn't, Irene said. The static on the line flared, then subsided. He thinks he has it, but I took it from his desk before I left the cabin. I mailed it to your house 3 days ago, Denise. It should be in your mailbox today. The kettle on the stove began to hiss, a low, wet rumble that rose toward a sharp whistle. I reached out and turned the knob, cutting the flame.
The silence that returned to the kitchen was heavy,
broken only by the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window and the distant, muffled dialogue of Raymond's television show in the den. I stood there, the receiver still in my hand, listening to the hollow dial tone, until it turned into a series of rapid electronic beeps. I hung up the phone. Through the window, I looked down the long gravel driveway. The street lamp at the corner was flickering, casting long, shivering shadows across the wet asphalt. At the very edge of our property, the gray metal mailbox sat under the low-hanging branches of the maple trees, its red flag down. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my yellow oilskin slicker from the hook by the back door, pulled the hood over my head, and stepped out into the downpour. The rain was freezing, hitting my face like small needles of ice. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots as I hurried down the path, the wind catching the hem of my coat. By the time I reached the road, my hands were numb. I pulled open the creaking metal door of the mailbox. Inside, tucked behind the utility bills and a glossy circular for a local supermarket, was a thick, rectangular parcel. It was wrapped in heavy brown shipping paper, sealed with layers of dirty packing tape, and addressed to me in Irene Vance's shaky, uneven cursive. I clutched it to my chest, covering it with my slicker, and ran back to the house. I entered through the laundry room, shedding my wet boots and coat in the dark. Raymond didn't call out. He was still in his recliner, his head tilted back, his mouth open as he dozed through the evening news. I climbed the stairs to the guest room at the end of the hall, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. With my sewing shears, I carefully sliced through the thick packing tape. The brown paper peeled away, smelling of dust and stale sea air, to reveal the blue metal tin. The paint on the lid was chipped. The yellow flowers faded to a dull, greasy gray around the edges. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dried gray lavender stalks that crumbled into dust at my touch, was a stack of black and white photographs. I picked them up. My fingers were still cold, and the paper felt thick and stiff. The first photo was the one Maeve had described. Me on the drift log, looking out at the gray expanse of the Pacific. But the next one was different. It was a close-up. I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, my chin resting in my hand, looking directly at the camera. I wasn't smiling, but my eyes were wide, clear, and alive in a way they hadn't been in decades. And then the third photo. It was a self-portrait Calvin had taken using a timer. He was sitting next to me on the steps, his 19-year-old face smooth and unlined, his dark hair damp from the sea spray. His arm was wrapped around my waist, his fingers dug into the wool of my blue cardigan, holding me with a fierce, possessive grip. My head was tilted toward his shoulder. No one who looked at that photograph could mistake it for anything other than what it was. A portrait of two people who had found a private, quiet shelter in each other's wreckage. A daughter rarely looks at her mother and sees a woman with a past. To Maeve, I was an institution, a piece of the house that kept her warm. If I showed her these, I would destroy her image of her mother forever. I would prove that her perfect fiancé was a predator who had targeted her to get back at me. But I would also prove that I had lied to her for 12 years. I would have to pay the debt of my secret in full. A sudden crunch of gravel outside broke the silence. I walked to the window and parted the blinds. Down in the driveway, a car had parked behind my sedan. It wasn't Calvin's blue van. It was Maeve's small red hatchback. She got out of the driver's seat. She didn't have her umbrella, and she didn't run. She walked slowly up the concrete path, her head bowed against the rain, her shoulders slumped under her wet trench coat. I took the photographs from the tin, slipped them into the inner pocket of my cardigan, and hurried downstairs just as the back door opened. Maeve stepped into the kitchen. She was soaking wet, her blonde hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to the laminate table and sat down, her wet coat dripping water onto the linoleum floor. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table with a trembling hand. "Maeve?" I said, standing near the sink. "What is it? What happened?" "I helped him print the papers," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any of the frantic energy she had carried all week. "He went to the bathroom, and his laptop was open on the desk. His email was active." She looked up at me, her face pale and hollow in the dim light of the kitchen. There was an email from a developer in Seattle, Mom. A man named Miller, no relation to us. He was asking Calvin if the title on the Elm Street house had been cleared yet, he said. The board was ready to sign the purchase agreement the moment the wedding certificate was filed. She swallowed, a single tear cutting a clean path through the damp dust on her cheek. "He doesn't want a partnership, Mom. He's not merging his firm. He's selling this house to developers who want to tear it down and build a strip mall. He's using my signature on the trust to liquidate everything. He doesn't love me at all. He just needed a girl who was stupid enough to sign the papers." She buried her face in her wet hands, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, devastating grief. I walked over to her. I stood behind her, my hands hovering over her wet shoulders, wanting to pull her into my arms, to tell her that I would save her, that I would fix it. But I knew that a mother's comfort was no longer enough. The structure was already falling, and if I wanted to save her from the collapse, I had to let her see the ruins. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the black and white photograph of 19-year-old Calvin with his arm wrapped around my waist. "Maeve," I said quietly, setting the picture on the wet manila folder in front of her, "there is something else you need to see." Maeve slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her skin was splotchy, her eyes red-rimmed and watery, catching the dull amber light of the kitchen clock. Her gaze drifted down to the manila folder, and then her fingers froze. She stared at the black and white photograph resting on the wet paper. At first, her face didn't change. She looked at it with a vague, blank curiosity, as if she were looking at an old advertisement or a picture in a stranger's scrapbook. Then, her eyebrows knitted together. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and picked up the stiff paper, holding it close to her face. "What is this?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, the sound of a dry leaf scraping across concrete. "Mom, who is this?" "It was taken 12 years ago, Maeve," I said. My hands were flat against the kitchen counter. My fingers pressed hard against the laminate to keep them steady. In Gearhart, on the porch of the cabin where I stayed, she looked at the 19-year-old Calvin in the photo. She looked at his arm, wrapped tightly around my waist. His fingers dug into the wool of my blue cardigan. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide, glassy, with a sudden paralyzing confusion. "No," she said, shaking her head. A sharp, nervous laugh escaped her lips. "No, Calvin is 31, Mom. 12 years ago, he was 19. He was a kid." "He was 19, I said, my voice quiet, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. "And I was 42. Maeve dropped the photograph onto the table as if the paper had suddenly grown hot. She stood up, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a loud, harsh shriek that echoed through the dark hallway. She stepped back, her hands raised slightly, her body tense. "You?" she whispered. Her face twisted into an expression of profound disgust, her lips curling back from her teeth. "You and Calvin?" "I left your father that summer because I couldn't breathe in this house anymore," I said, forcing myself to look her directly in the eye. "I went to the coast. I stayed at a cabin owned by his mother, Irene. He was there. I was lonely, Maeve, and I was foolish. And for 12 weeks, I let myself believe that the life I had built here didn't matter. But then you called. You cried on the phone because your father didn't know how to look at you. And I realized I couldn't leave you behind. So I came back. You came back to save me." Maeve's voice rose, a sharp, ragged sob breaking through the words. "Or did you come back because you were guilty? Because you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror?" "Both," I said. But Calvin never let it go. He didn't just want me, Maeve. He wanted the life I had chosen over him. He spent 12 years watching us. He knew when you went into real estate. He walked into your open house because he knew exactly who you were. He used your father's greed and your loneliness to get inside this house, to take the only thing of value we had left, and to make sure I had to watch him do it." Maeve stared at me, her chest heaving, her wet hair clinging to her neck like pale, thin ropes. She looked at the photograph on the table, then back at me, her face pale as a sheet. "My whole life," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My whole life, you made me feel like I was the reason you were unhappy. You made me feel like your nervous breakdown was my fault because I was too difficult, because I didn't help enough. And all this time, you were with him. It was my sin, Maeve," I said, "not yours. But he is using you to pay for it." Before she could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen walls, casting long, shivering bars of white light through the rain-streaked window. The low, heavy rumble of a diesel engine filled the driveway, idling with that familiar, irregular shudder. The red taillights of the blue transit van illuminated the wet gravel outside. A car door closed. Then came the sound of quick, heavy footsteps on the concrete path, moving toward the back door. Maeve's eyes went wide with panic. She looked at the door, then at the photograph on the table, her body shaking so hard. Her teeth clicked together. The man she loved, the man who had promised her a beautiful future by the river, was standing on our porch, and he had no idea his mask had already fallen. "Hide the folder, Maeve," I whispered, grabbing her wet sleeve and pulling her toward the walk-in pantry. "Go in there. Don't say a word. Don't make a sound." She didn't fight me. She let me guide her into the dark, narrow space between the shelves of canned peaches and dried bay leaves, her eyes fixed on my face with a terrifying, childlike dependency. I closed the pantry door, leaving only a tiny crack so she could see. I wiped the water from the table with a dish towel, slid the photograph into my cardigan pocket, and turned toward the back door just as the knock came. 3 slow, polite, heavy raps against the glass. "Denise? Maeve?" Calvin's voice called out through the rain, carrying that same calm, reassuring baritone that had comforted my husband and my daughter for months. I saw Maeve's car in the driveway. I think she forgot her planner at my place. I unlocked the deadbolt. The brass mechanism turned with a heavy, final click, and I pulled the door open. Calvin was standing on the porch, his wool coat dark with rain, his cream-colored scarf tucked neatly around his neck. He was holding a black leather planner in his hand, a warm, apologetic smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late, Denise," he said, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen without waiting to be invited. "But I knew she'd need this for her listings tomorrow morning." He stopped. His slate-gray eyes scanned the quiet kitchen, noting the wet spots on the floor, the empty chairs, and the stillness of the house. The smile on his face didn't vanish, but his eyes grew narrow, cold, and incredibly sharp. "Where's Maeve?" he asked softly. "She's upstairs, Calvin," I said, my voice flat, level, and completely devoid of the panic that was clawing at the inside of my throat. She was tired. She went to bed. Calvin didn't look up at the ceiling. Instead, his slate-gray eyes drifted slowly down to the corner of the kitchen, where Maeve's wet trench coat hung from the brass hook. A small pool of water had formed on the linoleum directly beneath it, reflecting the dull amber light of the stove clock. "She came home in the rain without an umbrella," Calvin said softly, pointing to the dripping coat with the corner of the leather planner. "And she left my apartment rather abruptly. We were in the middle of organizing the title transition papers. She didn't even say goodbye." "I know," I said. "She was upset. She told me about the title papers. She also told me about the emails from Pacific Meridian, about a man named Miller in Seattle." Calvin's posture didn't change. He stood near the refrigerator, his wool coat still damp, his hands relaxed by his sides. But I noticed the way his knuckles had turned a hard, bloodless white where he gripped the leather planner. "Ah," he said, his voice dropping into a quiet conversational tone. "She was looking at my laptop while I was in the washroom. I suppose I should have locked it." "It wouldn't have mattered, Calvin," I said, leaning my lower back against the sink. "The truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep you bury it. You're not planning a partnership in Seattle. You're selling this house, my father's house." Calvin took a single step forward, his soft-soled shoes making a faint, wet squeak against the floor. "It's a practical decision, Denise," he said, his voice carrying a calm, reasonable authority that made my skin crawl. "This house is 60 years old. And the roof needs $40,000 in repairs that Raymond doesn't have. It's an asset. I'm liquidating a stagnant asset to secure Maeve's future in Seattle. If we stay here, we all drown." "We," I said. "You mean you drown?" "Your mother called, Calvin." For the first time since he had entered my house, the polite, calm mask on Calvin's face slipped. His jaw went completely rigid, the muscles in his cheek twitching once, twice, before he managed to still them. His slate-gray eyes narrowed until they looked like twin slits of ice. "Irene?" he whispered. "She told me about the cabin in Gearhart," I said, reaching into my cardigan pocket. "She told me how you took her land and how you're running from your partners. And she mailed me a package." I pulled the black and white photograph of the two of us from 12 years ago and placed it on the laminate table, directly under the harsh fluorescent light I had just turned on. Calvin looked down. His 19-year-old face looked back at him, smooth, unlined, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist, holding me as if he could keep the rest of the world from reaching us. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the steady, heavy drumming of the rain against the window and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Calvin reached out. His fingers, pale and long, hovered over the photograph for a second before he gently pressed his index finger against my young face in the image. "I kept this," he whispered, his voice dropping into that quiet, intimate tone of the boy on the beach. "I kept it because it was the only time I was ever happy, Denise. You think I did this just for the money. You think I targeted Maeve just because I was desperate? He looked up at me, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous intensity. I did this because I wanted to be part of your family. I wanted to be the one holding the structure together, because Raymond never could. He never looked at you. He never saw you. I wanted to build a life where you had to look at me every single day, even if you hated me for it. You're sick, Calvin, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No, he said, his voice rising slightly, carrying a sharp, desperate edge. I'm realistic. Raymond is going to die in a nursing home, and you're going to spend your last dollars paying for his bed. If Maeve marries me, we have a future. We have Seattle. I can settle the debts, and we can start over. All she has to do is sign. Suddenly, a heavy, uneven scraping sound came from the dark hallway. Denise? The dry, sleepy voice of my husband cut through the silence. Raymond walked into the kitchen, his faded blue bathrobe tied loosely around his soft waist, his feet in his old frayed slippers. He was leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes squinting against the bright kitchen light. He stopped near the pantry door, his shoulder almost touching the wood where Maeve was hiding. He looked at Calvin, then at me, and then his gaze drifted down to the table. What's all the racket? Raymond grumbled, his brow furrowing as he took a step closer to the table. Calvin, what are you doing here at this hour? And what's that on the table? My heart stopped. The photograph was sitting right there under the bright light, showing his wife of 30 years in the arms of the young man standing in his kitchen. Raymond took another dragging step toward the table, the rubber tip of his cane squeaking softly against the linoleum. His eyes, clouded by cataracts and thick with sleep, squinted down at the small, square shape of the photograph. What's that? He asked again, his liver-spotted hand reaching out toward the dark wood of the table. Before his fingers could touch the paper, I reached out and slid the photograph into my palm, dropping it back into the deep pocket of my cardigan. My movement was quick, smooth, and entirely natural, the practiced reflex of a woman who had spent 30 years catching falling glasses before they hit the floor. It's nothing, Raymond, I said, keeping my voice light and empty of tension. Just an old receipt Calvin found in his glove box for the catering deposit. Calvin watched me. He didn't move to stop me, and he didn't contradict my lie. He knew that if Raymond saw that photograph, his pride, the only thing Raymond had left, would force him to tear up the trust documents immediately. Calvin needed Raymond's quiet compliance for at least another weeks to secure the title transfer for his Seattle board. So Calvin played his part. Yes, Raymond, Calvin said, his voice returning to that smooth, respectful baritone that had won my husband over weeks ago. Just a billing discrepancy I wanted to clear up with Denise before the banks open on Monday. I didn't mean to keep her up so late. Raymond grunted, his mind immediately drifting back to his own physical discomfort. He adjusted his grip on his cane, his jaw clicking as he yawned. Well, you shouldn't be doing business at midnight, Raymond muttered, looking toward the window. The wind is coming straight through the casing. Did you leave the back door unlocked again, Denise? The draft is going right to my knees. I was just letting Calvin out, I said. Raymond looked at Calvin, his expression softening into that patronizing, paternal fondness he usually reserved for his old bridge partners. Did you look at the engine in Denise's car, son? That rough idol? I did, Raymond, Calvin said, his slate-gray eyes never leaving my face. It's just a loose belt. I can have my mechanic friend look at it on Monday. I'll pick the car up while you're at your physical therapy appointment. You won't have to worry about a thing. The sheer cold audacity of it made my breath catch in my throat. Even now, with his secrets laid bare on my kitchen table, Calvin was still weaving his web. He still believed he could win. He still believed he could slide into our routines, replace my utility, and take my home while I watched in silence. Inside the pantry, A small jar of preserved peaches clinked against a wire shelf. It was a tiny, metallic sound, but in the quiet of the kitchen, it sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Raymond blinked, turning his head slowly toward the pantry door. "What's that? Mice again?" "I told you to put those traps down by the flour bags, Denise." He reached out his cane, intending to nudge the pantry door open with the rubber tip. "No, Dad," a voice said. The pantry door swung open. Maeve stepped out into the bright fluorescent light of the kitchen. She was pale, her skin looking almost gray under the blue-white light. Her blonde hair was still damp, plastered to her temples, and her eyes were hollow, dry, and entirely empty of the nervous, desperate energy she had carried all week. Raymond stumbled back a half step, his slippers dragging against the floor. "Maeve, what the devil were you doing in the pantry?" Maeve didn't look at Calvin. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on her father, on his faded blue bathrobe, his dirty slippers, and the trembling hand he used to hold his cane. "He's selling the house, Dad," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was flat, carrying the cold, hard weight of a final judgment. "The papers you signed yesterday? You made him the co-trustee. The moment we get married, he's liquidating the Elm Street property. He's selling the land to developers in Seattle to pay off his own debts." Raymond's mouth fell open, his lower lip trembling slightly. "What?" No, that's Calvin is a partner. He told me it was a tax shelter for the estate. I read those papers, Maeve. I'm not an idiot." "He lied to you, Dad," Maeve said, taking a step toward him. "He lied to all of us. He's been planning this since, before he ever met me. He's drowning in debt, and he used your name to secure the loans." Raymond turned slowly to look at Calvin. The fond, patronizing expression was gone, replaced by a confused, defensive anger. "Calvin, what is she talking about? What developers?" Calvin stood perfectly still. His hands were still in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his slate-gray eyes had gone entirely dark. He looked at Maeve, and then he looked at me. He knew the game was over, but he wasn't going to go quietly. "Raymond," Calvin said, his voice dropping into a low, cold register that made Raymond flinch. "Your daughter is emotional. She saw some preliminary restructuring documents on my desk and jumped to conclusions. I was only trying to protect your assets." "He's lying, Dad," Maeve whispered. "He's been lying from the very first day." Raymond stood in the middle of the kitchen, his hand on his cane shaking so violently the rubber tip rattled against the linoleum. His face was a mask of stubborn, desperate denial. "Now, hold on, Maeve," Raymond said, his voice rising, carrying that dry, cracked authority he always used when he was losing an argument. "You're getting hysterical. Calvin's been very helpful. He's been taking me to my vascular appointments. He's a good lad. You're getting cold feet. Girls do that before a wedding. Your mother did the same thing." He was pleading, not with Maeve and not with Calvin, but with his own pride. If Calvin was a fraud, then Raymond was an idiot who had signed away his father-in-law's house because a young man had flattered him. He could not accept that. His vanity wouldn't allow it. Calvin saw the opening. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his shoulders relaxing under his wool coat as he stepped toward Raymond. "Exactly, Raymond," Calvin said, his voice dropping into that warm, deferential tone that suggested they were the only two sensible men in the room. "Maeve's been under a lot of pressure at her office. I think we all need to take a deep breath and discuss this in the morning. I'll go home and we can." I looked at my husband. I saw his fragile, shaking hands, his faded blue bathrobe, his desperate, pathetic cling to his own vanity. And then I looked at my daughter, who was watching him with an expression of such pure, hollow misery that it made my chest ache. I knew what I had to do. The cost was my own destruction. But it was the only way to cut the rope Calvin was using to drag them down. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the black and white photograph. I walked over to the table and placed it directly in front of Raymond, right under his nose, under the harsh white glare of the fluorescent light. "Look at the picture, Raymond," I said. My voice was quiet, flat, and steady. Raymond frowned, his mouth twisting with annoyance. "What? I told you, I don't care about some catering receipt, Denise. My legs are." "Look at the picture, Raymond," I repeated. Raymond reached into his bathrobe pocket, pulled out his reading glasses, and settled them onto his nose with trembling fingers. He leaned over the table, squinting down at the stiff black and white paper. The kitchen went completely silent. The only sound was the steady, heavy drumming of the rain against the window and the distant rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hall. Raymond stared at the photograph. He looked at his wife. 42 years old, looking beautiful, looking alive, looking at the camera with an expression of quiet, private surrender she had never once given him in 30 years of marriage. And then he looked at the 19-year-old boy next to her, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, holding her as if he owned her. Raymond's breath caught in his throat, a wet rattling sound. He took off his glasses, wiped them on the sleeve of his bathrobe, and put them back on, as if he believed his eyes were playing tricks on him. "When?" Raymond whispered, his voice cracking, losing all of its dry authority. "When was this?" 12 years ago, Raymond," I said, looking at him with a calm, pitying expression. "In Gearhart. When I went to the coast. When you told the neighbors I was at a clinic for my nerves." Raymond's hand on his cane gave way. He stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the wall near the pantry, his face turning a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at me, then at the photograph, and then slowly, he turned his head to look at Calvin. "You?" Raymond whispered, his lip trembling. With Denise?" Calvin stood perfectly still. The polite, respectful future son-in-law was gone forever. His face had turned into a cold, hollow mask, his slate-gray eyes empty of any warmth or regret. He didn't deny it, and he didn't apologize. He knew the game was over, but his expression was one of quiet, lingering venom. He walked over to the table, picked up the black leather planner, and tucked it under his arm. "You think you've saved them, Denise?" Calvin said softly, his voice carrying a cold, whistling quality that sounded like the wind through a graveyard. "But you've only made sure you all starve together. The bank is foreclosing on my mother's house in Gearhart next week, and Raymond's signature on the trust is already filed with the county clerk. It's public record now. You can't undo the filing without a court order, and a court order requires a public hearing." He walked toward the back door, opening it. The freezing rain swept into the kitchen, smelling of wet cedar, mud, and decaying leaves. "I'll see you in court, Denise," Calvin said, his slate-gray eyes locking onto mine for one last, terrifying second. "We'll see how much Raymond's pride can handle when the whole town reads your journals." He stepped out into the dark, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The sound of Calvin's van slowly died away, the low rumble of the engine swallowed by the steady, deafening roar of the rain. The headlights swept across the kitchen wall one last time, leaving us in the cold, white glare of the fluorescent light. The silence that returned to the house was thick, almost physical. Raymond sank into one of the green vinyl kitchen chairs. He looked incredibly old, his shoulders hunched under his faded blue bathrobe, his face the color of wet ash. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at Maeve. His gaze was fixed on the black and white photograph sitting on the table, his liver-spotted hands flat on either side of the paper, as if he were trying to keep the table from shaking. Maeve stood by the pantry door, her arms wrapped tightly around her ribs, her chin tucked into her chest. She was shivering, a low, silent trembling that she couldn't stop. "Raymond," I said, taking a step toward him. "Don't," he whispered. His voice was cracked, dry, and completely empty of the blustering authority he usually used to keep me in my place. "Don't come near me, Denise." "We need to look at the papers," I said. my voice quiet and steady, though my knees felt weak under my skirt. We need to see what he actually filed. You did this, Raymond said. He didn't raise his voice, but the words carried a bitter, concentrated venom that was far worse than shouting. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes bloodshot and watery behind his reading glasses. 12 years. 12 years I lived in this house with you, thinking you were just quiet, thinking you were just tired, and all the while you were carrying this. He pointed a shaking finger at the photograph. He was 19, Denise. A boy. You brought him into our lives. You did this to Maeve. If you hadn't gone to that place, he would never have found her. He would never have known we existed. It was the classic deflection of a weak man. Raymond could not face his own stupidity in signing the trust papers without consulting a lawyer, so he latched onto my ancient sin as the source of his ruin. If he could make me the villain of the story, he didn't have to be the fool. Dad, stop, Maeve said, her voice cracking as she took a step toward the table. Calvin scammed you. He made you sign those papers because you wanted to save money on taxes. How can you blame Mom for that? Because she betrayal, Raymond shouted, his hand hitting the table with a dull, hollow thud that made the teacups rattle. She's the one who brought him to our door. He followed her scent right to this house. I did not answer him. I had spent 30 years absorbing Raymond's anger, and this was just another bucket of dirty water thrown into an already flooded basement. Arguments in this house had never been about finding the truth. They were about finding a place to dump the shame. I walked over to the table, picked up the manila folder Maeve had left, and opened it. Inside were the copies of the trust documents Calvin had prepared for Raymond's signature. I turned the pages slowly, my eyes scanning the dense legal prose. The co-trustee form was there, signed by Raymond and notarized by a mobile notary Calvin had brought to the house on Thursday. But as I reached the final page, the legal description of the Elm Street property, something caught my eye. Calvin had attached the legal description from the 1998 refinancing deed, the deed Raymond had put in his name alone to clear his business debts. But Calvin didn't know about my father's will. When my father died in 1994, he didn't leave the house to me directly. He left it to me in a life estate with a strict reversionary clause. The clause stated that the property could not be sold, leveraged, or transferred to any third party without my explicit notarized signature, and upon my death, the title was to pass directly to Maeve. Raymond had refinanced the house in 1998. Yes, but the bank's notary back then had been a local man, a friend of Raymond's from the country club, who had overlooked the reversionary clause in my father's will because Raymond had assured him it was a formality. The refinance was legally flawed, and because it was flawed, Calvin's trust, which relied on Raymond being the sole, unencumbered owner of the property, was legally invalid. He had the signatures, but he had filed them against a title that Raymond did not have the sole right to transfer, but to prove it, to stop the developers in Seattle from moving forward, and to invalidate Calvin's co-trustee status before the marriage certificate could be filed. We needed the original, certified copy of my father's will, and it wasn't in the guest room desk.
"Where is my father's original will, Raymond?"
I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet kitchen like a cold blade. Raymond blinked, his chest heaving as he looked up at me. What? What are you talking about? It's in the safe deposit box at the bank. No, it isn't, I said. You closed that box in 2012 when the bank raised the fees. Where did you put the papers? Raymond's mouth opened and closed, his eyes darting around the room as his memory struggled to find the detail. I don't know. I gave them to Mitchell, your father's lawyer. Mitchell retired 10 years ago, Raymond, I said, my heart sinking slightly. His office on Grand Avenue is a dental clinic now. Then they're gone, Maeve whispered, her hand rising to her mouth. If we don't have the original will, we can't prove the life estate. Calvin's filing will stand. They're not gone, I said, turning to look at my daughter. Mitchell didn't destroy his files. He transferred them to his partner, Wesley. But Wesley moved his practice to the county seat, 30 miles north. We have to go there. Tonight, Raymond grumbled, his hand reaching for his cane. It's midnight, Denise. It's pouring rain. No, I said, looking at the window where the black rain was still lashing against the glass. Not tonight. We go on Monday morning, and Calvin is going to be waiting for us at the county clerk's office on Tuesday. I turned to Maeve. She was looking at me with a look I had never seen on her face before. Not when she was a little girl, and certainly not since she had grown up. It was a look of genuine, quiet respect. Get some sleep, Maeve, I said. We have a long drive on Monday. Sunday was a quiet, suffocating day. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a cold, gray mist that hung over the lawn like steam rising from a wet wool blanket. Raymond didn't leave his bedroom. I brought him a tray with tea and dry toast at 9, but he didn't look at me when I set it on his bedside table. He lay on his side, his back to the door, staring at the faded floral wallpaper. His silence was no longer the heavy, commanding silence of the master of the house. It was the small, pathetic silence of a beaten animal. His pride had been his only armor, and now that it was gone, he had nothing left to cover his frailty. Maeve spent the day in the kitchen with me. She helped me fold the laundry, her movements quiet and slow. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't complain about the brand of detergent I used, or the way the dryer left her linen blouses slightly wrinkled. Did you love him, Mom? She asked. Her voice was quiet, nearly drowned out by the steady, rhythmic thrumming of the washing machine. I stopped folding a white cotton sheet, my fingers resting against the warm, clean fabric. No, Maeve, I said. I didn't love Calvin. I loved the version of myself I was when I was with him. I loved the feeling of being a person who could make a choice, rather than a person who had to keep everyone else's lives from breaking. It was a very selfish kind of love, and it was very temporary. She nodded slowly, her fingers smoothing the hem of a pillowcase. I think I did the same thing, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't love Calvin. I loved the way he made me feel like I was the center of his world. I was so busy looking at myself in his eyes that I never actually looked at him. I never saw what he was doing until it was too late. It isn't too late, Maeve, I said. Not yet. Monday morning came, cold and clear, the pale winter sun reflecting off the wet asphalt of the highway. Raymond refused to go with us. I have my specialist appointment tomorrow, he muttered from beneath the blankets, his voice weak and raspy. My legs won't do that 30-mile drive. You go, Denise. Just don't let the neighbors see you leaving. They don't need to know our business. Even now, with his financial life hanging by a thread, his primary concern was the opinion of the people across the street. Maeve and I got into my sedan. The engine idled with that rough, irregular shudder, but it started. We drove 30 miles north along the river highway, the gray, swollen water of the Santiam, rushing past us on the right, carrying old logs and river debris down toward the valley. We arrived in St. Helens, the county seat, just after 10. It was an old timber town that had slowly turned into a bedroom community. Its main street lined with dark red brick buildings from the 1920s. Wesley's law office was on the second floor of the old Masonic Hall, a 3-story brick building with tall, arched windows that overlooked the public square. We climbed the creaking wooden stairs, the air smelling of old paper, floor wax, and the dry metallic heat of steam radiators. The brass plaque on the frosted glass door read, Wesley and Associates, Attorneys at Law. We stepped inside. The office was small and quiet, carpeted in a dull green wool that had worn down to the backing near the reception desk. An older woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain looked up from her computer. Good morning, she said, her voice carrying a professional, polite warmth. "How can I help you today?" "My name is Denise Miller," I said, leaning against the wooden counter. "I'm the daughter of Thomas Eldridge. My father's estate files were handled by Mr. Mitchell before he retired, and I believe his archives were transferred to Mr. Wesley." The receptionist's brow furrowed slightly as she typed my father's name into her database. Her fingers made a soft, rapid clicking sound on the plastic keys. "Yes," she said, looking at the screen. "Thomas Eldridge. The estate was closed in '94. The archives are kept in our basement storage facility." She paused, her face clouding over with a look of polite confusion. "That's funny." My stomach went cold, a sudden sharp prickle of dread rising along my arms. "What's funny, Mrs. Gable?" "We had a young gentleman in here on Friday afternoon asking for those exact archives," she said, adjusting her glasses. "A Mr. Vance," he said. "He was representing the Miller Family Trust and needed to retrieve the original will and the property files for an estate appraisal. He had a power of attorney form signed by Raymond Miller." Maeve gasped, her fingers digging into the wool of my sleeve. "Did you give them to him?" I asked. My voice was a whisper, but it carried a hard, flat authority that made the receptionist blink. "Well, yes, Mrs. Gable said, looking slightly defensive now. "He had the notarized power of attorney, and he had the original estate index number. He took the original signed will and the 1994 property deed with him. He signed the logbook, promising to return them by tomorrow morning." She turned her screen slightly toward me, pointing to the digital log. Calvin had known. He had studied my family so thoroughly that he had found the reversionary clause in my father's will before I even realized we needed it. He had used Raymond's blind trust on Friday afternoon, right after they signed the papers, to systematically strip the archives of the only document that could invalidate his claim. He didn't just want to take our house. He had already taken the proof that it was ours. "Mom," Maeve whispered, her face turning a sickly translucent white in the dim office light. "What do we do? If he has the original will, he can destroy it. He can burn it, and we'll have nothing but the 1998 refinance deed to show the court." I looked at the receptionist's logbook. I looked at Calvin's signature, elegant, precise, and completely devoid of hesitation. "He won't destroy it, Maeve," I said, my voice quiet and perfectly calm. "He needs it. He needs the original to show his Seattle board that the title is clear, or he needs to keep it hidden until the marriage is finalized. He's going to bring it to the county clerk's office tomorrow morning to file the final transfer." I turned back to Mrs. Gable. "Is Mr. Wesley in his office?" I asked. "He's in a consultation," she said, her eyes wide as she realized something was very wrong. "Tell him to call the county clerk," I said, "and tell him that a fraud has been committed using his archives. We'll be at the courthouse on Tuesday morning at 9. I suggest he joins us." We drove back to Elm Street in a silence that felt heavier than the gray mist hanging over the river. The sky had turned a hard, cold violet by the time I pulled into the driveway, the bare branches of the maples scraping against the roof of the car like fingernails. Inside, the house was dark.
Raymond was sitting in his recliner in the den, but the television was off.
The first time in 30 years I had ever seen him sit in a room without the flickering blue light of the screen to keep him company. He was just staring at his hands, his thumbs rubbing against each other in a slow, circular motion. "He took the papers, Raymond," I said, standing in the doorway of the den. Raymond didn't look up. "I know," he called. "He said he was finalizing the tax transition. He said, you and Maeve were hysterical, that you were trying to ruin the family because of some old grudge." "Do you believe him?" Maeve asked from behind me, her voice sharp with a lingering defensive anger. Raymond was silent for a very long time. The clock in the hall chimed the half hour, the brass pendulum swinging behind the glass door, with a heavy rhythmic click. "It doesn't matter what I believe," Raymond said, his voice small, cracked, and completely devoid of his old bluster. "I'm a fool, Maeve. I've been a fool for a long time." He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes clouded and watery. I thought, if I kept the house, if I kept the money together, you wouldn't notice that I didn't know how to talk to you. I thought, if I was the one who made the decisions, I was the one who was important. It was the closest thing to an apology he had ever given me. It wasn't grand, and it didn't undo 30 years of emotional neglect, but it was real. It was the quiet, tragic admission of a man who had spent his life building a castle out of sand, only to watch the tide come in. "Go to bed, Raymond," I said softly. "We have to be at the courthouse tomorrow morning." Tuesday morning arrived with a thin, freezing drizzle that turned the roads into gray glass. Maeve and I got into the sedan at 8. She was wearing her dark gray winter coat, her hair pulled back into a neat, tight bun. She looked pale, but her jaw was set in a firm, quiet line that reminded me of my father. She was no longer the anxious, fragile girl who had sat at my kitchen table crying over her swatches of white silk. She had grown her own armor. We drove to the county seat, St. Helens, parking in the gravel lot behind the municipal courthouse. The building was an imposing neoclassical structure built of gray granite, its tall columns stained with decades of Green River moss. We walked up the wide stone steps, our boots clicking sharply in the quiet morning air. Inside, the courthouse smelled of wet umbrellas, old wool, and the floor wax used to polish the wide terrazzo corridors. The county clerk's office was on the first floor, behind a set of heavy double doors made of frosted glass and dark oak. When we stepped inside, Calvin was already there. He was standing at the counter, a stack of folders open before him. He was wearing his dark wool coat, his cream-colored scarf tucked neatly around his neck, looking every bit the professional, successful consultant his Seattle board expected him to be. He was speaking to an older woman behind the counter, his voice low, polite, and reassuring. He turned when the heavy door clicked shut behind us. His face didn't change. The warm, polite smile remained on his lips, but his slate-gray eyes went completely dark, the pupils contracting into tiny black pinpricks. "Maeve," he said, bowing his head slightly. "Denise, you're early. I was just finishing the title transition for the trust. Sharon here was just helping me with the filing fee." "It's not your trust, Calvin," Maeve said. Her voice was steady, carrying a hard, flat clarity that made the woman behind the counter pause, her fingers hovering over her stamp. Calvin let out a soft, pitying sigh, the sound of a man dealing with a difficult child. "Maeve, we've discussed this. The power of attorney is legally notarized. Your father signed the co-trustee agreement on Thursday. The original will of Thomas Eldridge is right here. Everything is in order." He tapped the thick yellow document resting on the counter. My father's original, signed will from 1994, the one he had stolen from Wesley's archives. "The power of attorney was obtained under false pretenses, Sharon," I said to the clerk, "and the trustee agreement is invalid because the property in question is subject to a life estate reversionary clause. The co-trustee has no legal right to transfer the title." Sharon looked at me, then at Calvin, her brow furrowing with a sudden professional caution. She slid her stamp back from the papers. Calvin's smile finally vanished. He took a step toward me, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous whisper that had once made me feel like the only woman alive on the coast. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Denise," he said, his eyes holding mine with a quiet, lingering venom. "If you do this, the estate goes into probate. The Seattle board walks, and your husband's pension will be swallowed by the litigation. You'll lose the house anyway. Is your pride really worth that?" "It isn't about pride, Calvin," I said. "It's about foundation." Before he could answer, the heavy double doors of the office opened again. It wasn't Mr. Wesley, the lawyer. An older woman stepped into the room, leaning heavily on a three-pronged metal cane. She was wearing a worn green wool coat that was missing its top button, her gray hair sparse and damp from the drizzle. Her face was lined with a profound, bitter weariness, but her eyes, the same washed-out slate gray as Calvin's, were fixed on his face. Behind her stood a young sheriff's deputy, his hand resting loosely on his belt. "Irene?" Calvin whispered, his voice cracking, losing all of its smooth, calculated control. Irene Vance took a slow, painful step into the office, the rubber tip of her cane making a soft, sticking sound against the polished floor. "I told you, Calvin," she said, her voice dry, gravelly, and heavy with the flat vowels of the coast. "You're not using my name on another loan, and you're not taking Denise's house to pay for your Seattle sins." The silence in the county clerk's office was absolute, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant, muffled sound of a typewriter in the back room. Calvin didn't move. He stood by the counter, his hand still resting near the edge of my father's yellowed will, but his shoulders had gone rigid under his wool coat. He looked at his mother, at her worn green coat, her three-pronged metal cane, and the pale, washed-out slate-gray eyes that matched his own. For a moment, he looked 19 again. He looked like the boy who had sat on the drafty floor of the cabin in Gerhardt, waiting for someone to tell him he was allowed to exist. "Irene," Calvin said, his voice dropping into a flat, strained whisper, "what are you doing here? You should be in Astoria. Your treatment." "The treatment is over, Calvin," Irene said, her dry, gravelly voice carrying a heavy, bitter finality. "And so is the mortgage on the cabin. The bank took the keys on Friday. I have nowhere left to live because of your Seattle dreams." She turned her head slowly, looking at the young sheriff's deputy standing behind her. "This is Clatsop County Deputy Miller," Irene said, a faint, mocking smile touching her thin lips. "No relation to Denise. He was very helpful when I went to the station in Astoria last week. It turns out, Calvin, that signing your mother's name on a reverse mortgage when she has macular degeneration is considered elder exploitation and grand larceny." The deputy took a step forward, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound against the polished floor. "Mr. Vance," the deputy said, his voice professional and flat, "I have a warrant for your arrest issued by the state of Oregon. We've been coordinating with the local department here. I need you to put your hands on the counter, please." Calvin didn't run, and he didn't fight. He was too intelligent for a useless physical struggle, and he had spent too many years practicing the art of absolute control to let himself look foolish in a public office. He slowly placed his palms flat against the wooden counter right next to the original 1994 will he had stolen. The soft, metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. It was a small, dry sound, but it felt like the final hammer hitting the lock on a 12-year-old cage. The deputy turned him around, guiding him toward the heavy frosted glass doors of the office. Before he stepped into the hallway, Calvin stopped. He looked back at Maeve, at her pale, set face, her dark gray winter coat, and the silver ring she was still wearing on her left hand. "Maeve," he said, his voice flat, carrying no anger, only a quiet, hollow exhaustion. "I'm sorry." Maeve didn't answer him. She didn't cry, and she didn't look away. She looked at him with an expression of pure, cold detachment. The look of a woman who had finally looked through the glass of her own vanity and seen the shadow behind it. He was no longer her fiancé, her savior, or her future. He was just a stranger who had tried to steal her home. The deputy guided him through the doors, and the frosted glass swung shut behind them. Irene Vance stood near the counter, leaning heavily on her cane. She looked at me, her slate-gray eyes scanning my face, noting the gray at my temples and the lines around my mouth. "You should have stayed in Gerhardt, Denise," she said, her voice dry as dust. "But you were always too good for us. You had that house on Elm Street waiting for you." I had a daughter, Irene, I said quietly. Irene looked at Maeve, her expression softening into something resembling pity. She looks like you did, before the gray got to you. Don't let her spend 30 years apologizing for being alive. She turned, her cane tapping a slow, uneven rhythm against the terrazzo floor as she walked out of the office, her old green coat swinging around her thin ankles. The office went quiet again. Sharon, the county clerk, stood behind the counter, her stamp still in her hand, looking at Maeve and me with wide, bewildered eyes. "Mrs. Miller?" Sharon said, her voice trembling slightly as she reached for the folders Calvin had left. "I'm going to flag the title on the Elm Street property. No commercial sale or transfer can go through now. The trust filing is officially frozen pending a court review." She picked up my father's original 1994 will and handed it to me across the counter. The paper was dry, yellowed, and smelled of the old basement archives in St. Helens. "Thank you, Sharon," I said. I slid the will into my purse, zipped it shut, and looked at my daughter. "Let's go home, Maeve," I said. The drive back to Elm Street was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt dark and gleaming under the pale winter sun. The heater in the sedan hummed, the dry, warm air smelling of my old lavender sachets and wet wool. When we entered the house, the smell of cold tea and stale coffee was thick in the hallway. We walked into the den. Raymond was still sitting in his recliner, his faded blue bathrobe tied loosely around his soft waist. The television was still off. He looked up when we entered, his eyes searching my face, then Maeve's, before finally settling on the leather purse I was carrying. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I walked over to his chair, sat down on the small wooden footstool near his knees, and took my father's will from my purse, setting it on his lap. "The house is safe, Raymond," I said. Raymond looked at the yellowed paper, his trembling fingers tracing the elegant cursive of my father's signature. A single heavy tear slipped down his wrinkled cheek, lost in the gray stubble of his jaw. He didn't say thank you, and he didn't apologize. He simply let out a long, shuddering sigh that sounded like a balloon slowly losing its air. Maeve walked into the kitchen, her boots clicking softly on the linoleum. A moment later, the sound of the tap running filled the quiet house, followed by the low, familiar hum of the electric kettle. She was making tea for all of us. Maeve brought the tea into the den on a small wooden tray. She set a mug in front of Raymond, then handed one to me before sitting down on the edge of the sofa, her knees pulled up to her chest, her fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. The silver ring was gone from her finger. She had left it on the counter at the county clerk's office, a small, polished circle of silver sitting next to the empty folders. The steam from the mugs rose in thin, lazy curls into the cold air of the room. Raymond didn't reach for his tablet, and he didn't ask me to turn on the television. He just held his mug with both hands, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the dark, swirling liquid inside. The silence that settled over us was different from the silence that had governed this house for 30 years. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of things kept in the dark to protect a fragile peace. It was the quiet, exhausted silence of a family that had finally run out of secrets to tell. October came and went with a dry, freezing wind that took the last yellow leaves from the maple trees, leaving the branches bare and dark against the gray sky. The 12th of October. The date Maeve had written in her wedding binder in neat, rounded cursive, passed without a single word from any of us. There was no outdoor ceremony by the river, no white silk swatches, and no acoustic guitar music playing through the afternoon. Raymond spent the day in the backyard. His legs were stiff, his breath short and rattling in his throat, but he spent 3 hours helping me clear the dead summer vines from the garden trellis. He didn't bluster, and he didn't tell me I was doing it wrong. He simply held the heavy yard bags open, while I dropped the dry gray stalks inside, his fingers trembling slightly, whenever they brushed against mine. Maeve resigned from her real estate firm at the end of the month. She packed 2 suitcases, loaded them into her small red hatchback, and moved 30 miles north to Astoria, closer to the river mouth. She took a job at a small independent plant nursery near the docks, selling winter ferns and river cedar to the local fishermen. She rented a small, shingled cottage that overlooked the salt marshes. She calls me every Sunday evening at 7, just after the grandfather clock in our hallway chimes the hour. We don't talk about Calvin, and we don't talk about the summer of 2014. We talk about the coastal damp, the price of firewood, and the herbs she is trying to grow in the sandy soil of her small back garden. "The rosemary is doing well, Mom," she told me last Sunday, her voice carrying a quiet, steady warmth I hadn't heard in her since she was a little girl. "The roots are finally starting to take." "I'm glad, Maeve," I said. "Rosemary needs a firm foundation. It doesn't like to be moved. It is November now. The evening has turned cold and dark, a heavy coastal fog rolling up the river valley to settle over our street like a gray shroud. Raymond is asleep in his recliner in the den. His breathing is slow, heavy, and rattling, the sound of a clock that has slowly run down its mainspring. The television is dark, the only light in the house coming from the small amber bulb above the stove in the kitchen. I stand by the back window, looking out at the dark garden. The street lamp at the corner is flickering, casting those long, shivering shadows across the lawn that have defined the view from this window for 30 years. I look down at my hands. They are dry, lined with gray creases, the skin papery and thin over the knuckles. I spent 3 decades holding the walls of this house together. I smoothed over Raymond's coldness, I absorbed Maeve's defensive angers, and I kept the draft from reaching them. I carried the weight of my father's house and my own quiet sins in silence, making sure they never had to feel the ground shake beneath their feet. I kept the structure whole, but as I stand here in the quiet of the dark kitchen, listening to the slow, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, I realize that the house is finally still. The walls are solid, the roof is dry, and the people inside are safe from the storm. But there is no one behind me. There is no hand on my shoulder, and there is no voice in the dark waiting to ask if I am cold. I spent 30 years holding everyone together only to realize, in the quiet of the empty kitchen, that no one had ever been holding me. I stood in the quiet of the dark kitchen, the amber light of the stove casting a long, narrow shadow across the clean linoleum. Raymond turned his head slowly from the window. For the first time in 30 years, his eyes were entirely clear. There was no sleep in them, no confusion, and no shadow of the bluster he had used for decades to keep me at a distance. "Denise," he said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. I always knew about the cabin in Gearhart. The world seemed to lose its sound. I kept my hands flat on the counter, the wood cold beneath my palms. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. "I knew the day you came back," Raymond whispered, a faint, dry smile touching the corners of his mouth. A smile of pure, weary surrender. "I found the train ticket in your coat pocket when I was looking for the car keys. I knew about the 19-year-old boy. I knew why you couldn't look at me." "Why?" I asked, my voice thin as paper. "Why did you never say anything?" Raymond looked down at his wrinkled, trembling hands. "Because if I told you I knew, your pride would have forced you to leave. But as long as you thought you were carrying that secret alone, I knew your guilt would keep you here. I knew you would spend the rest of your life folding my laundry, cooking my meals, and keeping this house warm just to pay a debt you thought I didn't know you owed." He looked back up at me, his eyes hollow. "You thought you were saving us, Denise, but we were both just keeping each other hostage in the quiet." I looked at him, at the man I had spent 30 years serving, the man I had destroyed my own youth to protect. We had built our entire lives on a foundation of mutual silence, each of us holding the other's chains, waiting for a storm that had already arrived 12 years ago. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour. The sound was heavy, slow, and final. We are all prisoners of the things we choose not to say. We build our homes on secrets, hoping the floorboards won't creak, hoping the drafts won't blow the doors open. But eventually, the wind always finds a way inside. If you found yourself walking through the dark hallways of our home today, if you recognize the heavy, quiet burdens that families carry behind tightly locked doors, please consider subscribing to Forbidden Family Secrets. By joining our community, you ensure that these dark, hidden corners of human nature are never left in the dark. Subscribe today and let us sit together in the quiet for the next confession, because some secrets are too heavy to carry alone.